So I just would like to say warmly welcome to Linköping University and to this Department of Thematic Studies and this theme of technology and social change, both to all of you in the room, but also to the ones attending online. We are here today for the first occasion of the International Lecture Series Planning in Transition for this year, 2024. And for this upcoming year, we have a special focus on sustainable mobilities. And we have a number of distinguished guests. You can find the whole program online. But next up after this occasion is March 21st is Tim Svanen from the University of Oxford. But for today, I want to welcome Nicola Spurling from Lancaster University. And Nicola is a senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology and the director of the Center of Mobilities Research. And her research has focused on sociocultural aspects of climate change, including sustainable everyday mobility and life without children now lately. And she has published on issues like practices and everyday life, mobilities and energy consumption, and also writing on these things for different audience, both within and beyond sociology. And she has also been involved in numerous interdisciplinary research projects and centers and collaborated with a lot of different stakeholders. And I know that Nicola will talk more about this in a second. But just so you know, before Nicola starts, she will talk for maximum 1 hour. And then we will have time for some questions and conversations. And you that join online are welcome to post your questions in the Q&A section, and we will read them out loud. And after the lecture, we that are here in campus will have some refreshments outside the room. And hopefully the ones online can provide themselves with some nice things at home or in the office. So without further ado, I want to give the word to you, Nicola, and welcome here.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to write and give this talk as part of your international lecture series, and for all the work in arranging the visit and for the warm welcome and the great coffee as well. I'm Nicola. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology and currently the director of the Centre for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University. And for the past 13 years, my work has focused on climate change and social and cultural change, especially the transformations in everyday life and the design of everyday life that's associated with low carbon consumption. I initially trained in anthropology, and I think that my interest in ethnographic and participatory everyday life and material culture are partly stem from that background, as does my engagement with the particular theoretical traditions of mobilities and theories of practice. And like Karen said, my research is developed mainly in interdisciplinary projects and research centres that have included the Sustainable Practices Research Group at Manchester University, and then at Lancaster University in the Dynamics of Energy, Mobility and Demand Centre, the Institute for Social Futures, and the Centre for Mobilities Research. And the title that I've given today's talk is 5 Ways with Mobilities and Futures, Translations for Just and Sustainable Mobilities Transformations. And I wanted to use the talk as a chance to look back at a selection of projects from the past 10 years that have all been aimed at decarbonising everyday mobility. And I wanted to think about what it means to practice social science within a variety of cross-sector and interdisciplinary settings that are focused on that decarbonisation goal. By way just of introducing myself slightly further, this slide gives an overview of some of the funded projects that I will draw on today. So they're sort of on the left side of the screen. Right. Anyway, and yeah, in some ways you can see from the different funders of those projects, which I've put in italics, some of the different interdisciplinary settings that I've worked in. So in different combinations and at different times, those projects have involved working with sociologists, geographers, historians, innovation studies, industrial design, planners, fine art, more recently English literature, as well as transport planners and landscape architects. So different combinations in different projects. And also, just so you know, I do work beyond mobilities as well. So this just gives a sense of some of the PhD projects that I'm supervising at the moment. That are looking beyond mobilities in terms of transport, but that are still engaging in these questions of social and cultural change related to climate change. But in today's talk, I'm focusing on sustainable mobilities. Like I said, I'm interested in reflecting on projects from the past 10 years to consider what it is to practice social science within cross-sector and interdisciplinary settings. So I'm actually looking back at my own work in a way that's new for me. And I'm very interested in the practices that social scientists draw upon to bring new framings, concepts, and understandings into ongoing efforts for sustainable mobility transformation across the range of settings where those kind of different futures are being made. So I very much want to focus on the how rather than the what of my work. And to do that, I want to draw on the work by Susan Lee Starr and Starr and Griesmer, who did work on translation and boundary objects to understand these kind of cross-sector engagements. In the first part of the talk, I'll introduce the particular ideas from that work that I'm interested in thinking with. And then in the second part of the talk, I want to explore the kind of translations and the boundary objects of 5 different projects that I've worked on. And then I want to end a little bit speculatively by proposing an initial catalogue of translations for social scientists who are working on just and sustainable mobilities transformations. So the talk differs from anything I've done before in 2 ways. Firstly, it's an attempt to look across previous work with this question of how in mind. And secondly, I'm going to introduce some projects that weren't funded, as well as those that did happen. So I'm going to talk about proposals written but not funded, as well as kind of projects that got funded and happened. And I think that that's really relevant in kind of shifting focus to the how and to the kind of translation and the knowledge creation. I think that the process and the methods and the work of translation is often happening in that very kind of sometimes very long and laborious process of actually writing a collaborative research bid. So in that sense, it reveals something of the invisible work of academia and something of the invisible work of the just and sustainable mobilities transformation that we're trying to bring into being. So on to the first part of the talk, and I want to look at some ideas in the work of Starr and Griesmer, which I'm finding very helpful at the moment. And I want to begin with 2 ideas that really resonate with me, having worked in cross-sector settings. One is this notion of cooperation without consensus, which is one of Starr's entry points in her kind of first paper about this in 1989. And also then the notion that knowledge translation is itself a process of creation. So, and I think I've got interested in this, in sociology in the UK at least, until quite recently, it's been mainly the output of research that is kind of evaluated and valued, with kind of engagement or the engagement of the process of research or some of the other products associated with those engagements kind of taking a second seat in terms of how they're valued. And that's something that started to really intrigue me, partly because of working with designers and artists, which are disciplines where the practice is an aspect that's really emphasised. So, yeah, when you're working with artists, they talk a lot about the practice, what their practice is, spend a lot of time kind of conceptualising and thinking about that practice and what effect it has on the world and on their work. And more recently in the UK, the last few years, there's been quite a noticeable shift for sociology as well, in terms of this valuing of engagement. And in some ways, it makes me look back at my own work in a different way. But to come back to the work of Starr and Griesmer, through a variety of research projects, which involved exploring archives of scientific work or observations of scientific processes in the present, Starr comes to the conclusion that although many models of collaboration portray collaboration as first requiring consensus, actually this simply isn't the case. And in fact, consensus isn't necessary for cooperation, nor for the successful development of knowledge. And yeah, I find that starting point very useful, and it's one I want to pick up on today. And they initially explore this question of cooperation without consensus in a 1989 paper, which is based on an archival study of the Berkeley Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. And in this kind of historical case where they look at how the museum was made, they show that the museum was developed through the cooperation of different actors who generally operated in really different social worlds or different communities of practice. And yet they found ways to work together. And through this case study, they develop an analytic framework to understand and interpret the processes of this historic case. So they basically develop a framework to understand how the museum was brought into existence when there was no consensus over what the museum actually was. And then they suggest that their framework has potential for exploring knowledge creation in other settings. And they also go on to refine their ideas through work in other settings as well. And importantly, they say that cooperation without consensus was possible because of the emergence and ongoing engagement with boundary objects and standardized methods. So the last of those, the methodologies, the standardized processes, is somewhat self-explanatory. Procedures that could be followed by multiple actors who were part of different social worlds, which then created these forms of knowledge that could be communicated across those different worlds. Boundary objects is less self-explanatory because this is an analytic concept that they propose to refer to those scientific objects which both inhabit several intersecting social worlds and satisfy the informational requirements of each of them. And I'll say a little bit more about boundary objects in a moment. But I suppose just to represent these ideas in a figure, this is a kind of redrawing or a reinterpretation of a figure from the 1989 paper with the specific boundary objects of their case kind of shown. So here, a range of kind of allies or actors kind of work together. They create passage points. So passage points are these instances where specific actors assert particular requirements that other actors must address for the working together to continue. And then these boundary objects take these different forms. So in this case, some of the boundary objects were the terrain of the state of California. So the different actors saw California in different ways. They kind of would kind of fill out that map of California in different ways. But California itself meant something to all of them. Similarly, the museum was kind of vague and yet kind of shared. And also things like species and subspecies of mammals and birds. So all of those boundary objects had these qualities of interpretative flexibility. They were kind of vague in a shared context, but could be made more specific in local contexts. And they were recognized across all the actors or allies involved in this endeavor. And that this then just creates a more abstracted version of that model that can be thought about in other contexts. And they also then go on to identify 4 different kind of abstracted types of boundary objects that can be worked with in this way. The first is the idea of repositories or ordered piles of objects that are indexed in a standardized fashion, for example, a library or a museum. And here, the kind of problem of heterogeneity is overcome because all the actors can kind of borrow the resources from this repository and use it for their own purposes without having to kind of justify the purposes to this kind of collective endeavour. The second is the idea of ideal type, which refers to kind of a diagram or a concept or a description, which doesn't actually describe the details of one locality or thing, but abstracts from domains and is adaptable to local sites. They also then propose the idea of coincident boundaries, so common objects with the same boundaries but different internal contents. In their example, California State, which meant something to both the amateurs and to the professional ecologists in their case study, and to the trappers who were helping collect data, even though they saw it quite differently. And finally, they talk about standardized forms, so methods of common communication across dispersed works groups. And in 2010, Starr kind of refines or restates the concept of boundary objects in reaction to kind of 2 decades of, I suppose, thinking about the idea, but also being posed questions about it and seeing it taken up in ways that perhaps sometimes she thought were misconceived. So she sort of, first of all, makes clear the boundary is actually referring to a shared space where the sense of here or there is confounded. The object is not necessarily a physical object. It's something that people act towards and with. Its materiality derives from the action, but not from a sense of prefabricated stuff or thingness. So although it could be an object if it was being used in this particular way, it's not necessarily a kind of physical object as such. And these boundary objects have interpretive flexibility. They reside between social worlds as a vague and common object, and they reside within specific social worlds in ways that can be tailored and worked with. And groups that are cooperating without consensus kind of take the boundary object back and forth, tack back and forth between those different meanings of it. And so I suppose an embellished version of the figure then would show the different social worlds of the actors on the one side, the boundary objects on the other, and kind of this like dynamicness in which the boundary objects move back and forth, making this kind of collaborative work possible. And I wanted to, I suppose I'm taking 2 points from this, this work for my talk today. The first is these concepts of translation and boundary objects. But the second is more comes from this, the temporal positioning, which comes from the methods that they used in this case. And what I mean is that in this work, they looked back historically to identify how the museum was created through collaborative work without consensus. So I want to ask, okay, if we put ourselves into 2075 and look back at the archives of how the just and sustainable mobilities transformation happened, what kind of knowledge translations would form part of that process? I'm especially interested in how knowledge that's created through the specific concerns and questions and concepts and methodologies of social science, how does that become part of this collaborative work of decarbonisation? How did you place yourself in the sites and settings where transitions and futures were made? Which actors did you work with? How did you assert alternatives or specific concerns and questions and concepts within processes? What practices and methods and strategies or techniques did you develop? And what other concepts of collaboration, cooperation, participation did you bring to your practice? So these are the sorts of questions that I suppose I'm posing to you in some ways, and we're going to continue the discussion in the workshop tomorrow. There are also questions that I'm kind of posing back to myself, having been through these 10 years kind of in different projects, in different settings, all of which in some way are seeking to collaboratively make a decarbonised mobilities future. So in the next part of the talk then, with kind of equipped with these particular conceptual ideas and questions, I want to look at 5 different initiatives, like I said, some funded and some not, that I've been part of in the last 10 years. And these are the 5 specific things that I'm going to look at. So the first was from 2012. It was a policy report and an exhibition called Interventions in Practice. The second was from 2016, and it was an intervention experiment called Parking in Utopia. The third one is a funding proposal from 2019 called Repainting the City. Then also a funding proposal called Making Multimodal Futures. And then finally, one that was funded in an ongoing project called Societal Readiness. And so I'm going to take each of those in turn, say a little bit about them, and look at some of these translations and boundary objects that I think are present in them. So the first case is Interventions in Practice from 2012. And this is a policy report that I worked on when I was in the Sustainable Practices Research Group at Manchester. And the context of this project is that ideas of behaviour change and behaviour change approaches were kind of circulating and actually quite dominant in policy at that time, perhaps still are. And at the same time, there was this strong critique emerging from the social sciences. And the Sustainable Practices Research Group was looking specifically at how practice theory might provide some alternative ways of thinking and forms of intervention for policymakers. And the Scottish Government, who were one of the funders of the project, invited us therefore to, okay, can you write us a report that explains to policymakers how practice theory would lead us to a different approach. And in order to do this piece of work, which, as with all pieces of work, had its own kind of time limitations to it and so on, the approach was to, through desk-based kind of conceptual work, to develop a framework drawing on practice theory, which could be brought to the analysis of 3 high-profile policy documents, one of which was in mobility, one was in food, and one was in housing, and through that work to exemplify the approach. I've shown on this slide kind of 2 of the key sort of figures from that report. And in the first one, it was basically like a table which took policy. It started with framings that were very common across the policy reports that we looked at in terms of approaches that innovated technology or focused on shifting consumer choice or changing behaviour to kind of address the challenge of high carbon consumption. And then the next 3 approaches kind of gradually tried to move from that kind of thinking of innovating technology and changing behaviour into approaches that were developed through taking some selected concepts from theories of practice. So one was called recrafting practices, one called substituting practices, and one was called changing how practices interlock. And the second figure that I've shown there tried to also then, it's called the iceberg of behaviour change, but it tries to say, you know, when you look at changing behaviour, you're just looking at the tip of the iceberg, and actually, rather than thinking about that behaviour as being a product of individual motivation or psychological reasons, instead we need to look at kind of cultural histories and the embedding of these practices in society, both kind of culturally, but also how they're kind of infrastructured into society. In this project then, I would say that the other allies or the other actors were the Scottish Government, and the sociologists working with theories of practice and sustainability. And some of the passage points, some of the things that were being asserted that we had to kind of comply with or meet were, first of all, a policy report that followed a format that was comparable to other resources that they already had. Also, the point that we had to provide advice specifically on behaviour change interventions. And from the Sustainable Practices Research Group, our passage point was that we had to be working with ideas of practice theory and bringing those to this challenge. And I think that in this case, we had kind of two boundary objects in play. The first was kind of this diagram, but also the concept of behaviour change, and using that as a kind of taking that and using it as a vague idea that we could then kind of bounce off or build on to kind of try and develop understanding of policymakers. But also the figure itself, which has become, it's been used now and reproduced in a variety of different texts, books and so on. So this kind of iceberg of behaviour change has come to have a little bit of a life of its own beyond the project. And also this kind of table, which is also got a bit of a life of its own, which kind of starts from a kind of common way of policy thinking and tries to move away from it, would be the second kind of boundary object in this case. The next example I wanted to look at was called Parking in Utopia. And this was quite different. This was an installation that I did at what was called the Mobile Utopia Experiment. So it was part of an international mobilities conference. And the conference itself was preceded by a 2-day Mobile Utopia experiment where we had installations over Lancaster campus and across the city that were all somehow trying to, I guess, prefigure a mobile utopia, however that was framed by the author of the installation. And the one I did, it was building on some work that I'd been doing around the history of parking, the normalisation of a parked car as part of house design. And then I built on that to look forward into explorations of futures of parking, which were emerging with different vehicle ecologies. And sort of, so ideas such as shared and integrated transport, I was thinking, okay, what's the future of parking in those scenarios? And in this experiment, I basically took a parking space on the Lancaster campus, inspired by the activist movement that's called Parking Day, where they encourage people around the globe on a particular day in September to rent out a parking space and imagine what else it could be as if it wasn't used for stationary cars. So yeah, I did this part on campus. I made it into a quite nice, cool space with tea and coffee and cake, but also with this activity where people were invited to then build from Lego their parking space in a future without cars. And also then to have a discussion around what else would need to happen to make that future possible. In this case, then, I think that the other actors or allies involved were, well, first of all, the Mobile Utopia Conference Committee who funded it, but then also participants at the conference, other academics, but other guests who came, because people from across the city were invited, as well as students that so happened to come across it, and myself as a sociologist. And various passage points on this one were around the criteria of getting the funding in the first place. And I suppose my own research programme as well, in terms of continuing to develop these ideas around everyday mobilities and mobilities design. And with this one, I think the main boundary object was this coincident boundary. So the parking space, 2.4 metres by 4.8 metres, standardised and very translatable across a number of contexts, which also has meaning to people in their everyday lives. surprisingly kind of powerful meanings, in fact. And yeah, so then it became this kind of mode of translation and of having these conversations about the future and about kind of mobilities and disruptions to mobilities. The third example is a proposal, like I said, that didn't get funded, but in this case, this was called Repainting the City. And although it wasn't funded, I feel like a lot of this translation work went into actually creating the bid in the first place. So this was a collaboration between sociology, landscape architecture, urban design, and transport planners. And it built on some ideas that I'd been developing in a working paper called Lancaster Lines. And I was drawing on Tim Ingold's anthropology of the line and considering the threading of lines through everyday practices and everyday mobilities, and also then professional practices as an aspect of mobilities design. So I'm talking about like the lines that are painted on streets and so on. And the proposed project was to repaint a street in Lancaster for one summer. And the purpose was to be used in this intervention as a cultural probe or an experiment, both a cultural probe to explore with publics how changing conventions and standards of line painting could play a part in ruling out the car and drawing in alternatives, but also a probe into what kind of challenges would actually be encountered to try and put this kind of different public realm in place. And the intended output of this proposal was there would be an implementation guide which would provide insights and advice for local councils around the UK on how to deliver temporary public realm for low carbon initiatives in specific places, and some of the barriers and permissions and liabilities involved. In this case, the different actors involved were, first of all, Lancaster City and Lancashire County Council, also Sustrans, which is a kind of national cycling initiative that is trying to embed cycling in society, Street Spirit Design, which is a landscape architect company, and then the sociologist and the funder. And once again, I think there were various kind of passage points in bringing this together. For Lancaster City and Lancashire County Council, they really wanted to do some work with the public around some proposals that they had for sustainable mobility initiatives. For Sustrans, they wanted to continue their work in developing a cycling society. For Street Spirit Design, as landscape architectures, they were very interested in landscape architecture as an aspect of mobilities design. Once again, I suppose there as the sociologist trying to do something that was kind of meaningful towards this kind of achieving these decarbonised mobilities in specific places. But as I was also discussing with Karen before, we're also having that kind of face towards making contributions to academic debates. And the funder themselves, who were looking to pilot schemes to decarbonise transport in specific places. And yeah, it didn't get funded, and I think in many ways it did fall down slightly on that last one, in that it wasn't directly addressing enough the decarbonisation ideas of the funder at that time. What was interesting is that about sort of 3 months after this proposal, COVID-19 happened, and a huge amount of redrawing of lines and reallocation of road space, creation of public space kind of happened in response to that pandemic. And something that had sounded a slightly out there proposal was actually happening around the world. It was quite interesting to see. But in this case, I suppose I feel like I need to slightly adapt these categories of STAR, because rather than coincident boundaries, it was more like a coincident interconnection in that I was conceptualizing the lines as kind of threading through mobilities, connecting mobilities to other mobilities, but also to end use practices, but also as being things that also thread through practices of planning and governance and landscape architecture, but in different ways, and with the different actors having different jurisdictions over what could happen to these lines. I've just got two more that I was going to look at, but the next one was also a proposal. It was a much bigger proposal, and it was called Making Multimodal Futures. And this was a collaborative bid between sociology, Transport for Greater Manchester, Microsoft Research and Development in Bangalore, the Connected Places Catapult in the UK, and Dispatio.org in Bogota. And this bid focused on exploring emerging forms of non-car multimodal lifestyles, looking across days, weeks, and seasons, and in 3 cities. And it developed from work on interventions in practice, some of the work on future parking, and new forms of interchanging that I'd been looking at in relation to that. And I was bringing those ideas into dialogue with visions of integrated transport and new urban vehicle ecologies that were starting to appear in policy documents. And I suppose bringing into that discussion of integrated transport temporalities, so thinking about how in everyday life, modes of transport are not only integrated within a single trip, but also in the logistics of that actually happen across days and weeks or differently in different seasons. And also that the kind of materiality of that environment is also dynamic and shaping how those multimodal mobilities happen. So this slide kind of shows some of the ideas from that project. It was thinking about how these kind of logistics of non-car multimodal mobility are happening, the moments of interchange, of how mobility is always connecting different end uses together, which has implications for stuff and clothing and bags and apparel, that it happens through different seasons and that has different implications for it. Yes, and some of the anticipated outcomes from the project were around things like developing, while seeing it as a skilled activity, developing how to multimodal mobility guides for citizens, looking at how different transport policies in different places may actually need to be seasonal rather than a kind of one fits all. So once again in this, a different selection of actors coming together. Some different passage points, I think in this, especially for Transport for Greater Manchester, they really wanted to understand what was happening in the urban core. They knew from their data that car use was reducing quite rapidly, but they didn't understand what was emerging, and they didn't have the methodologies to see the emergent either. Microsoft R&D had similar kind of questions around a new sort of e-rickshaw trial that they had and how that was becoming integrated into other vehicle ecologies. I think in this case, the boundary objects were integrated transport as an ideal type. Also kind of coincident boundaries in terms of they were about specific places. The development of new methodologies, which would provide a new kind of data about those places. And also, once again, this idea of coincident interconnections in terms of especially focusing on interchanging and what that looks like as a practice in everyday life. The final case is a project that I've been working on with Monica Busher since 2018, around an idea of societal readiness or societal readiness levels. And this was part of a project that was funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council called Decarbonate. So the N8 in that name refers to the 8 northern universities in England. So it was a network to specifically focus on place-based decarbonisation, but also kind of framing Northern England as a place where pilots and new initiatives might be developed. And as part of this project, Monica and I co-led the participatory co-design of something that we called societal readiness levels. And the kind of concept of this was that we wanted, quite often we found in these kind of projects that were cross-sector and interdisciplinary, that as the sociologists, we were seen as being there to help have the innovations accepted by society, or trying to help communities adopt new technologies. And we really wanted to kind of push back against that framing of our role, and instead to challenge the innovators and the planners and the local councils to be able to throw it back to them and say, no, is your innovation ready for society? Rather than looking to communities to adopt innovations that have perhaps been made without specific places or people or practices in mind. It didn't start out as a tool. It started out, we called it societal readiness, to try and bring this idea into a bid. And it was an idea that we had to then keep developing and explaining as the project unfolded. And we did that by, first of all, we established a stakeholder reference group who began to work with us on the idea of societal readiness. And that reference group had a range of different people representing different places, also representing different types of actors, so business, local authorities, and also stakeholders who were somehow able to speak to people with different needs. So we had the youth parliament who were involved. They were very much focused on 11 to 25-year-olds and the mobility needs of 11 to 25-year-olds. We had other people there, like a landscape architect who had done a lot of work around with the Royal Society for the Blind, so understanding the needs of partially sighted and blind people in these spaces and so on. So we had this group that were working together to think about this question of, are these innovations ready for society? And they were doing so in different ways. We then took the idea and continued to develop a kind of tool, which initially in its lowest prototype version was a list of questions that were encouraging innovators to engage with aspects of social justice, mobility justice, thinking more broadly about the public good that their innovation was bringing, thinking more broadly about how it engaged with the carbon agenda. So not only, like, for example, to look at the materials involved in actually producing the new innovation in the first place. So bringing that life cycle into this view of decarbonisation. Yeah, and as we went along and used it in different workshops with different stakeholders, trying it out and getting feedback, we developed and refined it. Also, not just the tool itself, but how it might be used, how we might frame it, who might want to use it. We then were able to actually, as part of this Decarbonate network that was funded, as the directors of that grant, we had 15 seed corn projects that we were able to fund through the grant. And so then we built this tool into the criteria for those proposals. So people who were proposing seed corn money, which was from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, were having to engage with these questions about, is your innovation ready for society? And so that meant that at least in those 15 pilot projects, we've somehow impacted the social justice and public good aspects of that work. We've then gone on to develop this kind of very lo-fi prototype into a prototype dashboard. And then we've recently signed over the intellectual property so that it can continue to be developed as an app and possibly as a subscription tool. And at this point, I was just going to show you the website. So this gives a sense of where it is at the moment. So SORA, Societal Readiness Assessment. And on this webpage, it just shows about the purpose, the benefits. So we see it as a way for places to consider new innovations that are, they're having to make decisions about how to invest with small amounts of money, with stories of like failure of new initiatives coming in from around the world. And so in that sense, it provides a tool to do some kind of broader thinking around what these innovations might mean for particular places. And we also kind of point out, how the tool might be used by different actors in different ways. In terms of the various, with this project, the actors involved, because we had such a engaged participatory process, and we had this network that we were working with and that was developing anyway across Northern England. We had a whole range of partners that we were able to draw on and bring into the process. And these are some of them here. I'll go back to my slides. Yep. I think what we did in this project was, so we had the actors, the allies were the partners on the Decarbonate project. I think that in this project, one of the things that I see as quite successful is that we were able to assert as a passage point the kind of lo-fi version of the prototype tool. And so it meant that with the seed corn funded projects, we were, asserting these things from what I see as a social science agenda around justice, public good, into the innovation process. Beyond the project, the stakeholder reference group identified local authority procurement processes as kind of a potential passage point as well. So you might imagine a scenario in which local authorities are instantiating that innovations have to have a particular kind of SORA score to be considered by them. We've got no idea if it will be picked up in that way, but that's one of the things that we started to imagine for the tool. I think that in terms of boundary objects, with this project, we were drawing on ideas of ideal type, standardized forms and the repository. So societal readiness just began as this quite vague idea that we were sharing with other people. And then it was being taken into those local contexts and given some meaning. And we were having to kind of sit with the different meanings and perhaps sometimes feeling uncomfortable, but nevertheless allowing that process. But it did mean that we also then had something that we were working with together when we were in these workshops and stakeholder reference groups. The standardized kind of form, the method of communication, is this kind of idea of a societal readiness level and a barometer which produces some sort of score. And we're finding that that kind of has resonance across different sectors and different actors. And as part of the process, we're also inviting the creation of case studies, societal readiness case studies from different places. So that's starting to build up as a repository that different actors can draw on. And so bringing my talk to an end, I suppose that, from this, can we start to work towards a catalogue of translations for just and sustainable mobilities transformations? To begin with, I raised this kind of question for social scientists. If we put ourselves into 2075 and we ask, how was the knowledge created through the specific concerns and questions and concepts and methodologies of the social sciences? How was that part of the collaborative work of decarbonisation? Then I think we need to start thinking about these questions of how did you place yourself into the sites and settings where transitions and futures were made? Which actors did you work with? How did you assert alternatives or specific concerns and questions and concepts into processes? What practices or methods or strategies or techniques did you develop? And how were you kind of thinking about these ideas of collaboration, cooperation, participation within your kind of social science practice? And I think through looking at my own work in this way, I guess I've sort of started to think through, okay, what could my own answer be to those kind of questions in terms of the different actors or allies that I've been involved with, how I've created passage points, especially in later work, and also some of the different kind of boundary objects that have been useful for these kind of translations across fields. So perhaps this is the start of an answer to my own questions. And yeah, in the workshop tomorrow, really looking forward to learning more from the people that are there about the sites and situations of your work and how you're kind of grappling with these questions about collaboration and trying to shape processes that aren't always kind of travelling in the way that we would like to see. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Nicola. Well, then I think we can. You can hear me online. Now we invite questions or comments from Nicola. So, if anyone in the room have any questions, or online, you can just write in the question and answer.
Thanks.
Section. Harald?
Thanks. So, is this?
I think it's on.
Yes. Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, Nicola. This was really a nice talk. I did like this societal readiness level at the end, and didn't quite understand which types of social innovations or projects, or so what was at the setback. I just thought, couldn't this be, because couldn't this be also be a kind of tool for critical social science used kind of to contextualize or deconstruct or critically question, these technology readiness levels, which are so dominant in the discourse and EU policies, and so on, where you could then, kind of require that you also need a kind of societal readiness, where then at the same time you can ask what are actually the social consequences, who is gaining from it, which you can use to ask critical questions also for these tools. Is this going towards such a direction, or what's the use then in the end of these societal readiness labs in this project?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so one of the reasons that we framed it as societal readiness was directly, I suppose, in response to technology readiness. So I suppose using that also as a way to try and use a vocabulary that was already familiar in certain settings that we hope we might have influence. So those technology readiness levels focus much more on things like market readiness and not looking at the types of concerns that we were trying to bring to that debate. Well, with the Connected Places Catapult, for example, which is this kind of organization that tries to bring these like innovations to market, they could see the potential of this societal readiness alongside that idea, almost as addressing something that they realized wasn't there, but they didn't know how to address. So we were seeing the tool as being like a accompaniment or a parallel that would be kind of entering that hope, this is the ambition, to create something that enters this field that doesn't have any space for those kind of discussions at the moment. And yeah, we've yet to see how far that can go. But this was the ambition. But I think you also suggesting almost like an educational tool for social scientists or something like this.
In response to one specific technology which is talked about in this TRM way, and you could ask them critical questions around this particular innovation from a critical social science perspective. Yeah.
So that I think this is what we bring in. And in terms of its use through the different activities and workshops and the stakeholder reference group, we sort of developed it through a series of case studies. For example, one of the stakeholder reference group members brought it to the idea of low traffic neighbourhoods. We looked at an e-bike trial. There was this trial of kind of automated delivery, food delivery thing in one town in the UK. So we started to think through it in relation to different mobility innovations at different scale, some more focused on a technology, some more kind of a policy, to see how it could just generate these different, to bring this way of thinking that if you're in social sciences and humanities is kind of quite natural or second nature to you, and yet which is, in other places there isn't that understanding or knowledge of how to do that type of thinking. So thanks.
Do we have Jakob?
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I have a similar or follow-up question on that. I wonder, I really like the approach with the boundary objects and the translations. I wonder where I can position normativity and responsibility issues within this, because you would bring up like very positive examples, all connected to somehow a social ecological transition and a good future for everybody. But the same principles and methods of like doing cooperation without consent could be used to build up much different futures. And I'm concerned with this question, like what is guaranteeing or what is helping like for good outcomes, and who's deciding on this? Yeah, and what did you learn from or what can we learn from the examples that you proposed concerning these questions, maybe? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think part of my answer to that question almost like, to me, part of the answer to that question is that I think sociologists or social scientists have a place in these discussions, and that so I suppose this is like one of the starting points for my work as well, is say like John Urry in his 2011 book on climate change and society, he takes the first chapter of that to make this argument for why sociologists should be kind of at the table of climate change. And then similarly in his 2016 book on what is the future, he's also then kind of developing a kind of similar argument about the fact that these futures have been made in many different settings by different actors, some very powerful actors, and that you know, there needs to be some kind of insertion of ourselves into that process. They need to be at the table, and I feel like that's kind of what I've spent 10 years doing, and it's quite difficult, but nevertheless I think it's important. And so I don't quite know how it answers your question, but I think I see it as part of, as someone who's working in this field as a sociologist or with these interdisciplinary social scientists, I guess, I think I see it as a responsibility to be trying to do that work. And in some ways I wanted to reflect, because that work isn't easy, and it's not easy to do it in a way that has any kind of impact, or and I think you do have to sometimes sit in settings where you're not particularly, where the other people there have quite a different view about what you do and what your role is than the one that you perhaps see yourself as having. So I think in some ways I kind of want to have a space where I can talk about how that's actually really challenging, often quite uncomfortable, but I've done it anyway, and I see other people doing that as well, and I think I've learned something, you know. I think that's the type of conversation I want to have. I don't know if it answers your question as such. Does it answer your question?
I don't know, but
yeah.
Okay, I can't see any questions from the online people, but if you have, please write them there. But I'll take the opportunity to also ask a question that is a little bit related to Jakob's. So I also really like this idea with the collaboration without consensus, and I think I have to think about it a little bit more as well, even though you really explained it in a good way. But my question was more like, did you meet any like resistance from the outside that was not part of the collaboration from the beginning? Like, for instance, in this parking example. So did you meet any resistance while doing that exhibition? And if so, could that also then be perceived as a collaborative actor? Like, are they also forming the project, if you understand what I mean, my question? Or how should that be perceived? And what is your, like, in general, if you met that kind of resistance?
Yeah, I understand the question, because I think that right, that kind of variety and of, I guess, responses and ideas about where we should be headed is part of being within this cross-sector setting, I think. I mean, I think some of that resistance is seen in bids not funded, or, you know, you can develop an entire bid that's based on multimodal mobility, and someone can say, well, that isn't the future. And so I think that's one way in which that's experienced. But right, it's not like I have like an idea of the future either. Like, this is the kind of also the kind of dialogic space that we're in, I think. And in some ways, I think so. And that's part of what I've been grappling with all along as well, is so in that first piece of work that I did that was about interventions in practice, that was about interventions in practice to create lower carbon ways of life. But what I was quite dissatisfied with about that work is it didn't make explicit any imagined future as such. And that kind of took me into these different, reading about different futures, different approaches or different ways that you can position that future within work. But obviously then is, you know, there are visions of the future out there. How are we going to handle those visions as sociologists? In the latter project, it's very much about kind of working with the technologists on those changes, but trying to shape the technologies in some way. That's quite a different type of approach than suggesting I don't know, an entirely different vehicle ecology. So I think that there are always questions that I'm grappling with, and in different projects I've engaged with that in different ways.
Okay, here we have a question from Sarah.
Thank you so much. You were getting at this question before, but I was just curious to hear a bit more about your experience, like as a critical researcher working with all these other people who have other professions. Like, what is that like? And do you have things that you are willing to compromise on, or things that you're not compromise on in terms of, I don't know, principles, commitments, just how, yeah, I'm curious about what it's like.
I mean, I think different things emerge in the different settings, so it's not like you can go in with a clear answer to that question. I guess also I wouldn't characterize it because I think across all those different sectors, it's not like people in one sector have one particular view, or people in one profession have one particular view. That's like a political space anyway. And so I think part of the process is collaborative work where you're identifying actors within those spaces that kind of want to engage with the challenge in a way that is aligned with, and I suppose for me those principles are to do with impacts on place, on everyday lived experience, on patterns of inequality, and wanting to think through and engage with those questions. And so for me, part of that process is finding ways to have those conversations across settings and sectors. And I think that there are alliances to be made across that. But I also think through the process of finding that, you have to be uncomfortable sometimes or engage in challenging conversations.
Question from Alexandra.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. So inspiring in many ways. And I would like to have a comment and ask you for a comment also about this societal readiness tool, which is really interesting. And when I saw your question, the driving question, is an innovation ready for society? I thought that maybe it would be possible to ask the twin question, is the society ready for the innovation? And I would like to know if you think it would be possible to put such a questions within this approach. I mean that when you show us this iceberg and say that the behavioral change is only, well, tiny top, yes, and we have still a lot of things under the covers, the socio-technical imaginaries, knowledge, individual motivation, etc. So maybe it would be good also somehow to contribute this kind of knowledge into the reflexivity, to have the twin tools, yes, giving answer on the question, is the society ready for the innovation? Because even if the innovation is ready for society, it could be difficult to implement at some moment. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I agree that those questions belong together and that it isn't the one side or the other. The reason we frame the question in that way is that I think at the moment the question that you said about is the society ready for the innovation is the one that is kind of often resorted to by developers of technologies and policies, that the kind of individuals or the communities are seen as a problem, and that they need to kind of consume better or make, change behavior. And so I wanted to be we wanted something that really switched the emphasis in the other direction, which is why we sort of framed it in that way. But, really, I think that part of that process is one that would involve innovators perhaps engaging more closely with people and with place and with ideas of diversity, with breaking away from particular notions of users that perhaps underpin developments. So in some ways, an emphasis on a process anyway that is more kind of bringing those two things together. But I mean, I think for that tool, we did really want to be pushing back against these kind of processes of technology development and trying to, ask for something different almost in those processes.
Thanks. Yes, yeah, thanks. I thought it was super interesting, and it's really interesting to see this kind of evolution of the projects and some of the ones that weren't funded. And I really liked, I mean, this is, I don't know, the project about painting the city, this one that didn't get funded. And as you were describing it, I was thinking about what had happened actually in Montreal, where I live, and then you noted that it happened elsewhere. And I was kind of, when you come, I don't know how to really frame the question, but when you come back to this idea of readiness and I guess the back and forth between society being ready, the technology being ready, and all these kinds of things, because perhaps now if you propose such a project, it would probably easily get funded. I don't know, because with the pandemic, so prior to the pandemic in Montreal, there were massive disagreements over bike lanes. And we had a new mayor or mayoress, and she put in a lot of bike lanes, and there's just a lot of backlash, a lot of anger. And then COVID came, and then all of a sudden it was easy to close off streets, make pedestrian streets, put the restaurant terraces out on the streets, paint the streets with, I don't know, hopscotch and life-size chessboards and whatever games and things. And then once that was done, it's been done every summer since. It's kind of like an expectation. And I mean, I don't really know where I'm going with this, but there's like, yeah, I don't know, like, I have no idea. But there's this kind of readiness, I guess, that just sort of happened completely unexpectedly. And now it would be very difficult to go back to take these things away, which only months before would have created, like, just would have been impossible. I mean, even some bike lanes were extremely controversial, even on the left, right? Because so many people drive. So there was just, I don't know. And so I'm just wondering how these maybe kind of, I guess, unforeseen parameters or whatever, if you're trying to think about possible futures, and then maybe how these kind of moments can be capitalized on. Because, like, for example, maybe in the funding for a project, the timescales are so long, you just can't bring this old project out, or I don't know. But how is there, I don't know. I'll digress. But I thought it was very interesting about the painting of the city.
There's I don't know if it was a question, so I don't know if this is a response. Oh, it's a response, because I think the COVID situation was very interesting. I mean, it's interesting, the notion of this idea of a parklet developed through a kind of utopian prefigurative thinking has become, and I've not looked at this to look at the kind of sequence and what's happened here, but I think it's an interesting case to look at, in that the notion of a parklet existed, that had obviously been developed through some kind of utopian thinking. I don't know what the impact of the art activism around Parking Day was in relation to that, but this idea of a parklet that could be implemented in various parts of cities, could be seasonally implemented. It was already like a design thing before COVID, but it wasn't always so. So I think there's an interesting story there. And then I think some cities had already been considering a kind of seasonal streets idea that were drawing on this like notion of a parklet and so on. And then with COVID, you saw various elements coming together. Like you say, and now it's interesting that is a kind of a permanent, seasonal, temporary infrastructural change that happens. There's a lot to unpick in that case, right, in terms of prefigurative practice, how far that gets you, or you might think it hasn't got you anywhere, but then the kind of situation is transformed, and then it becomes a part of the picture in a way that you might, that perhaps wasn't imagined before. I really like that as a case. I haven't unpicked it yet, but I think there's a lot to learn there about, prefiguration, invention and design, and so on.
Okay, here we go. One more question at least.
Thanks. I wanted to ask two things about your interactions with these different stakeholders, if that's all right. first if you run into any specific kind of challenges that you have been reflecting on in these interactions, and also if you have a sense if there's some kind of pattern or trend to what you think that they have gained from working with you and your colleagues. Yeah.
I mean, in relation to the challenges, I guess to speak quite personally, I suppose, I think there's a challenge of kind of doing that kind of work, but then also facing academia and kind of addressing all of the aspects that need to be addressed as part of these roles in this world, whilst also doing like that work isn't always kind of neatly coming together. In fact, sometimes it's pulling you in quite different directions. And so to me, I would say that's quite a big challenge, like to create a piece of work that is both kind of doing something kind of meaningful and cutting edge within the world that the external world, and that is also making some kind of headway on one or more academic debates. I think it's a huge task, right, that we all have to do each time we bring a bid together. And so, yeah, I see that as a challenge. I see it as something I've perhaps got better at doing over the years. In terms of how that works I mean, I think there was a period that is somewhat reflected in the kind of journey I've shown you, where there was a kind of a building of networks and relationships that I was part of, that continued for a while with particular people in these different roles in different sectors. So I think in that respect, everyone involved was somehow taking something in, well, putting things in, but also gaining things from that in terms of doing this kind of work. But that doesn't last forever, because everybody changes jobs and roles, or entire government departments change or don't exist anymore, and so on. So there's some kind of a temporality to that. I don't think there's like a once and for all. You can't claim a once and for all kind of benefit, but some kind of a temporality that is working for a period and achieving some things. That's how I would see it from my experience. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, last chance, almost. Okay, but then I will take the chance to just ask the question again. So, like, you were already like pointing at it in one of the last slides, but can you maybe dwell a little bit on, like, do you see any like patterns or particular links of which projects that were like funded and not funded in terms of these boundary objects and passage points? So can you, like, drawing on the theoretical framework, can you see like, okay, this is the tools for success or something like that?
I mean, I think taking those ideas, I mean, obviously it depends on which funder. I mean, I think that those, I'm going to say this and then I'll kind of criticize myself or something, but those projects that take those ideas that are kind of strongly out there in policy, like behaviour change or like integrated transport. And then using that to kind of, but filling it out with a different kind of twist or a different set of concepts. You know, I think that can, in terms of what receiving funding, yeah, that can, I think, work very well. But I think also, you know, at the same time, that then does frame what you do to an extent. Like with that work on sustainable practices and practice theory and behaviour change, it kind of locked that debate into, it locked practice theory in with behaviour change in a way that I think in certain settings and even in certain parts of academia, in a way that it, you know, it isn't really, I don't see practice theory as paired with behaviour change in that way at all. You know, in fact, it's arguing something quite different about how society is structured and how social change happens. And yet, yeah, so it seemed to be it became kind of connected in a way that I think in some ways was unhelpful. And yet in other ways potentially had some impacts in moving certain thinking in policy slightly more towards a sociological understanding. So that was quite interesting, that instance, I think, that it seems to have become somewhat muddled in not only out there but within academia itself. And I see, like, because like that report that I wrote was written for policymakers, but I see it taken up as and kind of worked with as an academic contribution, which is not how it was intended, and it's very selective in the ideas that are included in it. Yeah, so it's an interesting case, but yeah, that would be part of my answer. Yeah. Okay.
All right, thank you so much, and thanks to you, Nicola, most of all, and thanks for everyone joining. And don't forget to join on the coming occasions as well. Yeah. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.